The dust of the trail clung to Ilara's worn calico dress like a shroud, each particle a testament to miles of fear and a desperate, dwindling hope. The buckboard jolted, throwing her against the hard wooden side, and the man beside her, a bounty hunter named Grice whose silence was more menacing than any threat, offered no apology. His eyes, like chips of flint, had been fixed on the horizon for days, promising nothing but an end to his lucrative task. Now, the horizon had resolved itself into a stark, lonely ranch spread beneath a sky too vast, too empty. A lone figure stood on the porch of the log house, a silhouette against the fading light, tall and unyielding as the ancient pines that clawed at the edges of the cleared land. This was him, Silas Blackwood, the rancher Grice had been paid to deliver her to. Ilara's breath hitched. She'd heard whispers in the settlement Grice had dragged her from, tales of Blackwood's temper, his isolation, the hardness forged in some unspoken sorrow. They said he was a man who tolerated no nonsense, no weakness. And she, Ilara, was the embodiment of both in the eyes of the world she'd fled. Her stomach churned with a familiar dread, the phantom sting of leather on her back a memory so vivid it felt fresh. She expected the rancher to whip her. It was the currency of men who believed they owned a woman's life, her body, her will. Her former master, the esteemed Judge Thorne, had taught her that lesson with brutal repetition when she dared to refuse his advances, his rage culminating in a false accusation that had sent her running into the unforgiving wilderness. Now, there was nowhere left to run. Grice roughly pulled the horses to a halt, the jangle of harness unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. Blackwood, Grice grunted, his voice like stones grinding together. "Got your delivery?" "Woman, as requested." "Seems a bit skittish, but she'll learn." Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, a silent prayer catching in her throat. The porch boards creaked as the silhouette moved, descended the steps. She could feel his approach, a cold wave of apprehension washing over her. She forced her eyes open, meeting his gaze. It was shadowed, unreadable, his face weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of hardship, perhaps loss. He was younger than she'd imagined, but his presence was formidable, overwhelming the small space between them. He looked her up and down, a slow, deliberate assessment that made her skin crawl. There was no flicker of kindness, no hint of welcome, only a stark, assessing neutrality that was somehow more terrifying than open hostility. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, trembled. She braced herself, her chin lifting with a defiant tremor she didn't feel. Let him do his worst. She had endured before. She would endure again. She had to. There was no other choice etched into the barren landscape of her future. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of her presumed guilt and his anticipated judgment. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows, turning the ranch yard into a place of looming, monstrous shapes. This was it, the end of one suffering, the beginning of another. She waited for the pronouncement, the order, the inevitable lash of his anger or his contempt. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone, yearning for an escape that would never come. Silas Blackwood looked at the woman cowering before him, her face pale beneath the grime, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed too profound for a simple journey's end. Grice's casual cruelty, the implication of her being some purchased chattel, sat ill with him, though he said nothing. He'd sent word for hired help, a woman to manage the house, a necessity since Martha, his old housekeeper, had passed last spring. He hadn't specified a delivery like some piece of mail. He needed capable hands, not a broken spirit. He took in her threadbare dress, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. Something wasn't right. He paid Grice the agreed sum, his words clipped, dismissing the bounty hunter with a curt nod. Grice, eager to be on his way before full dark, mounted and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and an unnerving silence. Ilara remained frozen, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Silas's shoulder. He was a man of few words, his solitude a choice born of a grief that still lay like a stone in his chest. His wife, Sarah, and their boy, Thomas, taken by the fever 3 years gone. The ranch was all he had left of them, a hollow shell filled with memories. He gestured towards the house. "You can put your things inside. There's a room off the kitchen." His voice was rough from disuse, deeper than he intended. She flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but he saw it. He saw the raw fear in her eyes, the expectation of something far worse than chores. He saw the faint, discolored line of an old bruise peeking from her neckline, nearly hidden by her tangled hair. He wasn't a cruel man, though the wilderness had made him hard. He wouldn't strike a woman, or anyone defenseless. The thought repulsed him. He worked her hard the following days. There was firewood to chop for the kitchen stove, water to haul from the creek, floors to scrub, meals to prepare from their meager stores. He gave his instructions curtly, watching her. She was surprisingly strong for her slender frame, her movements economical, her silence as profound as his own. She never complained, never met his eye for long, but worked with a desperate intensity, as if trying to outrun a demon. He saw the blisters on her hands, the way she winced when she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, as she served him his supper of beans and salt pork, her hand brushed his as she set down the plate. A small, almost invisible silver locket, tarnished with age, slipped from the cuff of her sleeve, resting for a moment on her wrist before she hastily tucked it away. But he had seen it. And he had seen the almost faded, intricate carving on its surface, a pair of intertwined prairie roses. His breath caught. His father had commissioned such a locket, years ago, for the infant daughter of his dearest friend, a man named Alastair Munro, from a settlement further east, a settlement Ilara had mentioned in a rare, whispered answer to one of his direct questions about her origins. A promise had been made, a foolish, youthful pact between two optimistic fathers, to unite their families, their children, Silas and Ilara. He'd been a boy then, Ilara a babe in arms. Life had intervened. He'd met Sarah, fallen in love, married. The promise was a ghost, a forgotten whisper from a different lifetime. He looked at her then, truly looked past the grime and fear. The shape of her face, the color of her eyes, a certain stubborn set to her chin. Faint echoes of the Munro family resemblance, obscured by hardship, now struck him with the force of a physical blow. This terrified, hard-working woman was Ilara Munro, the girl his father had pledged him to. The irony was a bitter draught. He had sought a housekeeper and fate, in its cruel and mysterious way, had delivered him a promised bride, a woman who expected a whip, not a wedding band. He said nothing, the revelation coiling in his gut. What did this mean? He was a widower, his heart buried with Sarah and Thomas. This woman was a fugitive, clearly running from something terrible. The promise was ancient, made by men long dead, in a world that no longer existed for him. Yet, a flicker of something, a sense of duty perhaps, or a strange, unsettling curiosity, stayed his tongue. He watched her clear the table, her movements still tinged with that hunted caution. His dog, Shadow, a grizzled collie mix who had mourned Sarah almost as deeply as Silas had taken to resting his head on Ilara's foot when she sat mending clothes by the fire in the evenings. It was the first sign of warmth the creature had shown to anyone but Silas in years. He felt a profound weariness, a confusion that unsettled his carefully constructed solitude. He had no answers, only a growing certainty that the simple life he had sought to rebuild was about to become far more complicated. The arrival of Jedediah Thorne in the nearby, dusty settlement of Redemption Creek was heralded by the clatter of a fancy carriage and the arrogant pronouncements of a man accustomed to obsequious service. Thorne, portly and red-faced, his expensive suit out of place against the rough-hewn storefronts, began making inquiries at the general store, his voice carrying easily in the quiet afternoon. Martha, the store's owner, a woman whose sharp eyes missed little and whose heart held a surprising capacity for kindness, listened with a growing sense of unease as Thorne described a runaway woman, a thief named Ilara, who had betrayed his trust and absconded with valuable property. He painted her as deceitful and morally corrupt, a danger to any decent community. Martha had seen Ilara only once, when Silas Blackwood, looking grimmer than usual, had brought her in for supplies a week prior. The girl had been quiet as a mouse, her eyes downcast, but Martha had sensed a fragility, a deep-seated fear, not wickedness. She'd also noticed the way Blackwood, for all his brusqueness, had subtly ensured Ilara wasn't jostled by other customers, the almost imperceptible way his gaze kept returning to her, not with ownership, but with a strange, watchful concern. Martha offered Thorn noncommittal answers, her mind already racing. News of Thorn's inquiries spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. The community, usually slow to judge but quick to protect its own, became wary. Whispers followed Silas when he next rode in for grain. Some eyed him with suspicion, wondering if he was harboring a criminal. Others, remembering Blackwood's own quiet integrity, reserved judgment. Silas felt the shift in atmosphere. He heard the hushed conversations that ceased when he approached. Martha, on the pretext of discussing a new shipment of tools, quietly warned him about Thorn, describing the man and his venomous accusations. Silas listened, his face an unreadable mask, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. He knew Thorn, or men like him, petty tyrants who used their power to crush those weaker than themselves. He thought of Ilara, her silent diligence, the terror that still clung to her like a second skin, the faint scars he sometimes glimpsed. The pieces clicked into place. She wasn't a thief, she was a survivor. His protection of her, once a vague, unacknowledged instinct, now solidified into conscious resolve, though he still hadn't spoken of the promise, nor of Thorn's presence in the town. The secret lay between them, unspoken, a fragile bridge over a chasm of past sorrows. One late afternoon, a sudden, violent storm swept down from the mountains, the sky turning a bruised purple-black. Wind howled through the pines, and rain lashed against the cabin. Silas had been out checking on a section of fence near the river when the storm broke. Ilara, alone in the cabin, heard the distressed lowing of cattle from the small birthing pasture closer to the barn. One of the heifers, close to calving, was out there. Without a second thought for her own safety, driven by an instinct to protect something vulnerable, Ilara pulled on Silas's old oilskin slicker, grabbed a lantern, and plunged into the maelstrom. The wind tore at her, the rain blinding, but she fought her way to the pasture. The heifer was down, struggling, terrified. Ilara, her own fear forgotten, spoke to the animal in low, soothing tones, her hand surprisingly steady as she worked to help, drawing on half-forgotten knowledge from her childhood on a farm. Silas, battling his way back through the storm, saw the faint, bobbing light of the lantern. His heart leaped into his throat. He found her there, soaked to the bone, mud-caked, shielding the newborn calf with her own body from the worst of the wind and rain, the mother cow now standing shakily beside her. He helped them get the mother and calf into the barn's shelter. Back in the cabin, shivering before the fire Silas quickly built up, they drank hot coffee in silence. The shared crisis had stripped away some of their reserve. He saw not a fugitive, but a woman of immense courage and compassion. "You saved them," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She looked up, surprised, a faint flush rising on her cheeks. They needed help later that night. As the storm abated, she found him staring into the flames, his expression bleak. "I lost my wife and son," he said, the words torn from him, raw and painful. "To the fever. This ranch." It was their dream too. Ilara listened, her heart aching for his unspoken grief. She understood loss. She understood being haunted. She reached out, almost involuntarily, and laid a hand briefly on his arm. A small gesture, but it resonated in the quiet room, a silent acknowledgement of shared humanity, a seed of trust taking root in the harsh soil of their lives. Jedediah Thorn was not a patient man. His inquiries in Redemption Creek had yielded little beyond vague sightings and the unsettling sense that the townsfolk were closing ranks. He'd seen the fear in Ilara's eyes when she'd fled. He knew she wouldn't have gone far without resources. Blackwood's isolated ranch was the most logical hiding place. Fueled by wounded pride and a possessive rage that Ilara had dared to defy him, Thorn hired two rough-looking men from a saloon on the edge of the territory and rode out towards Blackwood's spread, determined to reclaim what he considered his property. He found Silas mending a corral fence, Ilara nearby, hanging out freshly washed linens that billowed in the crisp morning breeze, a picture of domesticity that enraged Thorn further. "Blackwood!" Thorn's voice, sharp and imperious, cut through the morning quiet. "I've come for my runaway servant, Ilara. She's a thief and a liar, and she belongs to me." Silas slowly straightened, placing his hammer carefully on a fence post. He turned, his body a solid, unmoving obstacle between Thorn and Ilara. His face was calm, but his eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a dangerous light. Elara froze, the color draining from her face, the sheet she held slipping from her grasp to the dusty ground. The nightmare had found her. "She's no servant of yours, Thorn," Silas stated, his voice low and steady, carrying an unmistakable warning. "And she's not going anywhere," Thorn sneered, his hand dropping to the Colt holstered at his hip. "Is that so? Are you her protector now, rancher? What is she to you, this whore you're harboring?" Elara flinched as if struck, shame and fear washing over her. But before she could crumple, Silas spoke, his words ringing with a conviction that stunned them all. "She is Elara Monroe. And she is my promised wife, by an accord made between our fathers. She is under my roof, and under my protection. You will not lay a hand on her." The declaration hung in the air, electric. Elara stared at Silas, her heart pounding, a wild mix of disbelief, shock, and a strange, burgeoning hope. Promised wife? This stoic, silent man, bound to her by some forgotten pact. Thorn's face contorted in disbelief, then rage. Promised wife? That's a convenient lie, Blackwood. She's mine. He drew his weapon. His 2 hired men moved to flank him, their own guns appearing. Silas didn't move, didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on Thorn, unwavering. "It's no lie, Thorn. And you will leave my land." Now from the cabin, Shadow, Silas's loyal collie, began to bark, a deep, menacing sound. Just then, the sound of approaching horses made them all turn. Martha, from the general store, rode into the yard, followed by 2 stern-faced ranchers, neighbors of Silas, their rifles held ready. Martha had indeed been suspicious of Thorn, her intuition honed by years of observation. She'd seen the fear in Elara and the quiet determination in Silas, and she'd decided that whatever trouble was brewing, Blackwood wouldn't face it alone. "Having some trouble here, Silas?" Martha called out, her voice calm but firm, her eyes fixed on Thorn. Thorn, seeing the tables turned, the odds suddenly against him, hesitated. He was a bully, not a fighter when outmatched. His bluster deflated, replaced by a sullen resentment. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he snarled, holstering his weapon with ill grace. "You'll regret interfering." He motioned to his men, and they backed away, mounting their horses and riding off, a wake of impotent fury behind them. Elara watched them go, her legs trembling so badly she could barely stand. Silas turned to her, his expression softening as he took in her pale face. He stepped closer, his presence no longer threatening, but a shield. He didn't touch her, but his gaze held a new warmth, a steadfastness that wrapped around her like a comforting cloak. The word wife still echoed in her mind, a foreign, impossible concept that now, somehow, felt like the only truth in a world of lies. The sun climbed higher, chasing away the morning chill, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elara felt a sliver of safety, a fragile bud of hope pushing through the frozen earth of her despair. The dust settled in the ranch yard, leaving behind a silence thick with unspoken emotions. Martha and the other ranchers offered Silas grim nods of support before departing, their presence a quiet reassurance that he and Elara were not entirely alone in this harsh land. When they were gone, Silas turned to Elara. Her face was a canvas of shock, confusion, and a dawning, hesitant relief. The term promised wife still hung between them, a revelation that had altered the very ground beneath their feet. He led her to the porch, to the worn bench where he often sat watching the sunset, a ritual of solitude that now felt different, shared. "The promise," he began, his voice low, the words carefully chosen, "it was made by my father and yours, Alastair Monroe. When you were but a babe, and I not much more than a boy. It was a common thing back then, a way to bind families, to secure futures." He looked out at the vast expanse of his land, the land that had tasted so much of his sorrow. "I had forgotten it, or buried it. Life took another path for me. I met Sarah. We built this place together." His voice caught, the old pain still a raw edge. Elara listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She remembered faint childhood tales of a betrothal, dismissed as old-fashioned nonsense by her practical mother, long before Thorn's shadow fell over their lives. When you arrived, Silas continued, his gaze returning to her, when I saw the locket, heard your name, it came back to me. I didn't speak of it. It didn't seem right. You were frightened, running. And I? He paused, searching for the words. My heart was a closed thing. Ilara finally found her voice, a mere whisper. Why did you say it? To Thorn? Because it was the truth, he said simply. An old truth, perhaps, but one I found I could not deny when he threatened you. He had no claim on you, Ilara. You are not his property. You are not a thief. I see the goodness in you. I've seen your strength, your kindness. He took a breath, the confession costing him. You've brought a flicker of life back to this place. To me, he looked at her then, his eyes clear, holding a depth of emotion she had never expected to see in his stoic face. The promise was made for us, not by us. It does not bind you if you do not wish it. Thorn is gone from here for now. If you want to leave, to find a different life, I will help you. I will see you safe. He offered her a choice, a true choice, free from coercion or obligation. The power he gave her in that moment was immense, a balm to wounds she hadn't realized were still so deep. She looked at his calloused hands, hands that had worked this land, hands that had defended her. She saw the lines of past grief around his eyes, but also a new light, a hope that mirrored her own. She had arrived expecting a whip, fearing a master. Instead, she had found a protector, a man of quiet honor, a man who saw her, truly saw her, beneath the scars and the fear. She had found a partner. I have been running for so long, Silas, she said, her voice gaining strength. I don't want to run anymore. This place, with you, it feels like the first safe harbor I have ever known. A slow smile touched Silas's lips, a rare and precious thing that transformed his rugged features. Then stay, Ilara. Stay and let us see what kind of future we can build from an old promise and a new beginning. The sun, now high in the sky, bathed the ranch in a warm, golden light. The vast, empty landscape that had once seemed so threatening now felt full of possibility. The mended corral fence stood as a symbol of healing, the linens on the line flapped like banners of newfound peace. Later that day, they worked side by side, mucking out the barn, the silence between them no longer strained but comfortable, companionable. Shadow trotted happily at their heels. As evening approached, they shared a simple meal, not as master and servant, but as equals. The cabin, once filled with Silas's solitary grief, now held a quiet warmth, the scent of wood smoke and baking bread, the murmur of two voices tentatively planning for the morrow. The fear that had been Ilara's constant companion had finally receded, replaced by a resilience she hadn't known she possessed and a hope that blossomed like a prairie rose after a long winter. Here, on this remote frontier ranch, beside this unexpected man, she had found not just a refuge, but a home. She had been delivered to a man she expected to break her, but in his recognition of a forgotten promise, and in the quiet courage it took them both to embrace it, they had instead found the path to their mutual redemption, a future forged not in expectation of pain, but in the unwavering strength of shared hope. What would you have done if faced with such a past, such a choice? Sometimes, the most unlikely paths lead to the truest destinations, and the deepest wounds can, with courage and an open heart, begin to heal, proving that even in the harshest wilderness, love and belonging can take root and flourish.